All right, we are back here with Eduardo Tapia to discuss some legal issues as we always do here in Cabo real estate. And one thing that I wanted to go over, we got two main questions today, but one was about wire fraud.
hmm
So we're increasingly in a digital age. This can happen anywhere. And I know of a situation where there was wire fraud and somebody was basically saying, hey, Fletcher, it's a foreign country. I was uncomfortable, so I was just taking um, orders from somebody who I thought was doing things. But at the end of the day, you have to double check. There's a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, how do you protect yourself from that? It's going to be very similar to a transaction in the States at this point. It's double checking, confirming.
hmm
But just any advice you could give on how people are phishing these days and maybe any instances that you've seen in Cabo real estate.
Yes, certainly. One of the things that comes to mind is that in hot markets like the one we're experiencing in Cabo, there's a lot of transactions that are over delivering in their promise to have certain units ready to go on a certain date. And that is pretty much the case where it never happens. And so then the question turns on, what do you do when you don't have the unit, but you obviously know that you're in a position that if you don't pull the trigger to at least secure the price, it's going to be a price that is going to be higher in the future. So with all of these factors, we then say, well, there is a timing issue. And so when people are pressed for time, they do not necessarily do their appropriate due diligence. And it's common sense. Even if it's in Mexico, as if it were in the States, you have e-banking, you have escrow, or the use of escrow that could be readily available either in the States or in Mexico. But people, for some reason, think that when they do business in a foreign jurisdiction, a foreign country, then that they're basically at the mercy of the people that are recommending certain practices. And while it is customary to have certain things done in a certain way, it doesn't go as far as just bypassing any type of safety protocols with regards to money. One of them is delivering monies to the seller directly, right? And we've already touched on that on another interview where the buyer should have the leverage of the transaction. And if you give that leverage away by giving monies directly to the seller, well, then you give that part away as the controlling party in the transaction, because the buyer should control it, because the buyer is paying the bulk of the closing costs. And so when that happens, people start not necessarily paying attention as to saying, well, I've given X percentage of the funds up front to seller. There might be circumstances where you want to have monies given directly to seller when there is like a price and pre-construction pricing, because the developer, the seller, will need the money, right, to start the building of the unit. But the part where I explain to clients, and people have already approached me after the fact, right? It's after the problem arises. But there are a number of ways you can do to avoid this to begin with. One of them is just simply saying, okay, what's the percentage that you want up front? And so this is my percentage in the case of a pre-construction pricing. And it should be, in regards to the whole percentage, probably 10 to 20% tops. After that, you start to get into progress payments. But if the developer or seller stresses that they need their money on a certain date without any type of consideration with the construction progress, then that part is a red flag right there, because the negotiation of payments normally goes on, let's say, a monthly or bi-monthly period. So when people start saying, well, we need this money to start, that's fine. But then the remaining part, if you start giving that money away, then you're just stuck with no construction progress, and you have less and less of leverage to actually go in and say, okay, where's my title? Because then at the end of that period, you have maybe 10% holdback, which is not really a lot. If you look into the whole of the transaction, there's not a lot of things to have the seller motivated and incentivized to actually close and deliver title before a notary public. And I've seen that happen various occasions where they have basically, or even they have 100% of the funds. They were trying just to kind of, it's kind of like pulling teeth. Hey, get me title. I've already given you the money. Where's my title? And this can go on even for months or years. And so that's kind of like a long answer to this part, but I wanted to give that background because people have approached, my firm with specific questions of things that have happened. And one of them, to your initial question regarding wire fraud, well, money should go to the escrow. I mean, I always use escrow. I recommend it. If again, the only exceptions in my book would be this pre-construction pricing, where you can give funds to seller directly. Other than that, funds should be there. There might be an amount of money that goes hard after due diligence, which is standard, right? You give 30 or 45 days to do a due diligence. Maybe you give 10, 15K up front to kind of say, hey, look, I'm a serious buyer. I want to take a look at your documents, do my homework, and if everything pans out, we give you, that money directly to you, which is again 10, 15%, which is fine. The problem starts where, let's say the seller says, give me money to me as an individual. If there's an entity involved, well, why am I not giving money to the entity that holds title? Money should always be given, in the case of this part, to escrow agent, and the disbursement instructions of the escrow should go to the owner of record. So if the owner of record is an entity, well, funds have to be in that named account. The problem starts to arise where people send monies to escrow, and then the escrow agent prepares disbursement instructions to different individuals. Like, why is this person receiving money directly? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, it might be the architect, it might be the builder. The explanation has to be, logical. But again, to avoid these things, it's like, hey, this is my amount of money. I've worked hard to get this amount of money in the door, and so once it goes out, I want to make sure that the funds are going to be, good and proper for that use. And what has happened, and people have approached me, is simply because they've done a mistake and said, I've given money to a different party, or even without the use of escrow, which is obviously a no-no. But a lot of people start thinking that we could save $650, $750 the use of escrow, and they say, well, let's just use it without the escrow. The problem is that when you start giving money, then people can even alter accounts. We've seen this happen as well. People say, well, this is my account, and then it gets doctored in the documents into a PDF. There's a number of things that can go wrong, and that's where you have to, say, well, why am I giving money to X? And in the case that we were, associated with, or at least not associated, but we came into knowledge of this, is because the initial payments were done to escrow, and then there's this third payment that goes out to a different account. And like, why should I be giving money to a different account? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And that's where people get into trouble.
Yeah, so in that particular instance, it was, if you get an email about doing a wire, pick up the phone, confirm via email, but check with somebody.
Yeah, that somebody could be the bank and can say, well, can you confirm, the name on the account, right? And so if it checks out on the disbursement instructions, we're good. But people sometimes, think, well, why is this third payment going to another party? And if the explanation, it shouldn't check out, because again, it doesn't have any type of logic as to why that is happening. But the problem is that there are a lot of pushy sellers, and because they have this hot product and people are almost lining up to get that, they use that to their advantage and say, look, if you're not interested, I have another person that's not going to ask all these questions, and they're going to get a better price on this unit. You can basically wait, but the price is going to be 10-20% more because of your lack of action. And so that's when people, for some reason, they always err, instead on the side of caution, they err just on the side of economics, saying, I'd rather give me that discount now, secure the price, and that's when things go south. Why? Because, well, the money's what they were after. They were not necessarily delivering product of a unit that's going to be built. They didn't ask questions. And the other thing I have to say, not because I'm counseled to buyers and sellers, it's just approach people that are in the know, people that do this for a living, to basically check. We are in the business of not creating problems, but avoiding problems. And so in order to avoid them, we have to have, at least I guess, the humility to say, look, let's say I'm a real estate broker in the U.S. I've had X amount of years of experience, but it just so happens it's in the U.S. In Mexico, it's not completely foreign. There's obviously a purchaser, there's a seller, there's an escrow agent, but we have other safeguards in place that are not present in the U.S., such as the notary public. But even then, the notary is an independent party, so you need to have someone on your corner looking out for your interests. And people sometimes want to save on that. Sometimes it fares well, but the problem is you can't really flip a coin with money that are let's say they're good funds, and you want to create more of of wealth with units and basically get a good margin, the return, investment properties, things of that nature. And that's when people say, well, I'd rather have this unit rather than have the money in the bank, for example, which is a good thing. The problem is that if you don't actually go to an expert and say, well, let's protect the interest, and be very, very cautious as to how you go about dispersing funds, because people even send funds not even to the seller, even to, I've seen it happen, to attorneys involved in the process. Well, why should the attorney be receiving funds of the actual purchase price? It doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't do it in the States. Why would you do it here or in Canada, or people looking at this from other parts of the world? It's just logic. Why would you compromise these funds and give funds to people that really do not have any business having those funds? They might be using those funds properly, but still there's a lot of red flags there. So again, just be cautious. And then one telltale sign of things that are not going to be necessarily good, and it's a red flag, is the press for time. If you have any transaction, no matter what the purchase tag is and the price, you always run into problems when people say this has to happen yesterday because this is a really good opportunity. And that's when people get emotional and they buy because they are not thinking with their heads, they're thinking with their hearts. They love the property, they love the community, they love the view, they love the building quality of this, and then everything goes out the door. And that's when people get into trouble.
Let me ask you this. This particular situation that someone reached out to me about, they got an email, and it was from an outside email. When you set up escrow and you're wiring money to escrow, you make like an initial payment, right? And the second payment, that's always going to go into the same account, right? So not only was an email sent from an outside account and the guy just thought, oh, hey, it's time to make this deposit, the numbers matched up, but it was also sent to another account. Correct. If he had just verified with somebody and then on top of it realized that it was a separate account, this would have not happened.
Exactly, because by the time he realized it, he thought, hey, the money went to a different account. That account, obviously, someone provided that information. We don't know exactly who provided that. When they reached out to me when this transaction took place, they kind of let me know that it was sort of like the attorney involved in that, but it turns out it wasn't. The attorney actually did the work of confirming what the safety, if there was a breach in their safety, internet, the protocol, and it turns out that they were not compromised. And it was just a matter of, as you said, hey, why is this third payment going to a different one? You call it the escrow. Because obviously funds should be pooled into the same holding, of funds in the account. If they use of U.S. escrow or Mexico escrow, there are several companies that do that here. It's just simple as that. Hey, this has to happen with this. Now, the disbursement, obviously, I've done a transaction a couple of weeks ago where I was escrow for certain funds simply because I really didn't trust my client to do the right thing and pay all these creditors, because she had a lot of pending payments after many years of litigation. So I said, I want this money gone into my account, and then I dispersed it into the other ones. But these are just things that happen that I know kind of to protect that. But again, just calling them up, emailing, and just taking a step back. Because if you feel pressured for whatever reason, just don't do whatever you're being asked to do, and just reach out and say, hey, I'm being asked to wire funds directly. I'm being asked to do this, and just say, okay, we can look into that. But then people think that we're, again, it's just going to be too expensive, right? Well, it turns out it's going to be more expensive if they run into all this trouble, because then they're out 150K or 200K simply because they didn't do their homework. And there's there are various factors as to why that happens, but the majority of times it's just simply emotional purchases and just saying, hey, I trust this guy, he's a good guy, I like him, or her. It's just a good experience altogether with the sale process, which is good. I mean, that's the reason why they're there. They have people that are affable, they're people that are eloquent, and they tend to have a rapport with their purchasers, which is exactly why they're there to begin with. But when it turns to, let's say, the next step, which is a legal step towards the transaction, you just have to let the experts handle this and not necessarily go on whatever the recommendation is, which is also the second of red flags is, oh, you have to use this particular company or this particular attorney or this particular notary or this particular trustee, which are all of those are decisions of the buyer. Because if you have a situation where, hey, we're going to use this notary because he has all the background information, well, just photocopy it and get it to the other guy. I mean, it's not rocket science. But then there's certain, you have to have certain degrees of separation between developer and the notary public. And sometimes when things happen like that, and there's various developers that do that, but others do recognize that, right? They're like, hey, if you're paying for that, the buyer is paying for all these closing costs. Why should they have to be using, this? Is there something funky going on? Why are we not using, why are we not able to freely choose our, service providers, if you will?
Yeah. So if you're getting an email about a wire, always double check it. And I've even seen little things where maybe a developer gets a new account,
Mm-hmm.
And it'll just cause like a delay. But wiring money to an older account, and it's like, hey, they're wondering why the money didn't get there. So just always double check. That's obviously not a serious situation, but in order to avoid a serious situation of wiring the money to a wrong account, double check.
Yep.
And with the attorney, the agent, everything.
Exactly. Yeah, because once counsel is retained, then they know that the process tends to be a little bit more honest and open, because they know that they can't pull a fast one on the client. So I make it an issue of saying, hey, this person is being represented. Please have all the communications go through me. And even though they obviously think it's easier just to go directly, and then I come back and say, hey, I told you already, everything has to go through me. I will inform my client it's not proper for you to reach out directly, and we can obviously do that. And if there's a fluid communication between the parties, we don't have to have an issue. But then certain developers and certain people are very much like, hey, I have the initial contact. Why should I not be continuing emails? Well, because that person is not the expert. And so whatever you tell them, they're going to say probably yes to it because it makes sense, at least in their mind, to do this or that. And so they should basically just confirm with counsel when we have been retained. But that's why we always have to have that, again, that independence of just criteria. And again, we're not dealing with something that is super complex, but still it sometimes gets very complex because of certain things. There might be creditors involved, there might be a mortgage initially, so we just want to make sure, and all of that comes up through the due diligence process. But part of that gets kind of overlooked is the money part. Like, okay, let's say the property is free and clear and the owner of record is checked out with the title that you're being presented for review. But still, when the time comes to send funds, they go in and do all these strange transactions because that's what they were recommended to do, and that's obviously not very prudent to do just what the seller or developer says. We obviously have to look into that. They obviously talk a good game, and that's what they're here for. But we've seen various developers that didn't do the right thing, and that they've kept the money, and they didn't do the things they promised, especially when it comes to construction.